Senescence is the debut full-length album from Vile Rites, I think Santa Rosa, California-based progressive death metal band who they tend to describe their sound as psychedelic death metal. And I think that in terms of literal definitions of psychedelic music, that would usually call for something that has to do with a drug-induced experience, something that transcends usual typical thought and perception. And I think that will come together as you experience their music, but it wasn't really obvious what they meant when they came out with their first EP back in 2022. I remember they sent me the EP, and I was like, well, it's an interesting sounding band, and in a clip, I was like, well, yeah, this is my kind of thing for sure. I could hear a bit of technical thrash metal, a little bit of stargazer type movement. I think around the time Enigmatum was kind of in my head. It was a great band, and that reminded me of that sound at the time, but maybe from more of a thrash metal built place. And it turns out these guys have mostly started out in thrash metal bands, or at least played in serious thrash metal bands over time, including Vector and whatnot. But they came together as a trio for this band when it had started up proper, and the Aegis was this really strong introduction. It was a little bit straightforward. It didn't quite have as much flourish as this record does, and you find that they're kind of balancing the brutal with the more ethereal. There's certainly fans of Opeth, and I don't think that's uh, immediately obvious when you break into one of their records, but the more that you might sit with the nuance and the way that they flow between the heavier and the more drifting parts, you'll see that it makes a lot of sense how they parsed that out. And they do have influences from classic progressive rock in general, and you'll feel that much more on this album than you will on the EP. So before I get too far into what this album is, let's cut into a song and get some sense of what it sounds like and their approach and how the record kind of evolves over time. I think the thing that struck me most about Vile Rites from the first time I heard them was that there's a balance of the brutal and the more ethereal. And in a way, earlier Inanna kind of touched upon that. Bands like Anatta and again Stargazer and Enigmatum, there's a sense of the push and pull of like the chasm and the way that their riffs move about. There's a little bit of technical thrash metal in some of those transitional movements and the energy they put into their work, but also there's classic progressive death metal in there as well. And you can tell that they appreciate the intensity of Gorguts and bands like Opeth and the way the more drawn out forms that they show up with. But this is more of a compacted thing that tries to come as close in juxtaposition as it can between the really heavy stuff and the more, again, the drifting stuff that moves around quite a bit. So there's a lot of intricacy in their work. It's very immediate up front. And so if you're a fan of classic 90s death metal and progressive death metal, you'll feel like it's ballsy enough, but there's still a wandering mind to it. And that's kind of the gist of why I like this band. But on Senescent, they take it a little bit further. They go into the depth of it, and they find more than just groove to beat around. And so there's a little bit more showmanship on this record, a little bit more of a path through that slows down and breathes just a little bit so that you can kind of catch kind of where they're going with it. And so that means by the end of the album, they've reached for much deeper places than we've heard before. There feels like there's a little bit of appreciation for melodic black death metal, a little bit of appreciation for death doom metal, and the atmospheric reach of that. So there's even points on here that remind me of Dream Unending, just as well as the Chasm, and I think that's a good barometer for how far they can stretch their sound from atmosphere to focused tightness and thrashing aggression. So it's a difficult thing to sum up because really the way that this EP plays out is that it packs a lot of intensity up front and it comes in waves beyond that point, and it sort of eases out as the last song kind of finishes the thought in a very big way. And I think that's both the best thing about this album and my biggest complaint about this album at the same time, is that the final song kind of waits to play around with some of their biggest tricks, some of the best things that they do, and it waits quite a long time to get there. So there's some tension that builds on repeat listens where it kind of is going to all come together in the end, but you're waiting for that moment where that big song at the end reveals some of the more intricate and interesting things that they do with this sound. So with a bit of patience and a full listen, I think if you take this record serious, there's a lot to get from it. And the way they presented it is pretty impressive overall. I think once you have the record, once you're looking at it and you're kind of pouring through it, there's a lot to gain from it. There's a lot of value, and I think there's a lot of sense and structure in the way that they've put this record together, where it feels like an experience that is tailored to the listener, as well as kind of idealized beyond the not quite complete thought of the EP. This feels like more of a complete thought, and for me, it's one of the best records of August. It's my highest recommendation for the month. It will be at the top of my list for August. Anyway, you can check it out today. This released today on August 16th, and for me, again, it's one of the best records of the month. It's very much worth checking out. Take it as one of my highest recommendations of August, and go ahead and read my review for much more in-depth thoughts on it.